Yes.
So, hi, I'm Kevin Resilient. I'm in a first-year PhD program in the political science department.
He's also an Air Force officer, Matt, watching.
Okay. Air Force officer, you said? Okay. Yeah.
Thanks for the talk. That was really interesting. One of my questions, you talked about how a lot of these policies are really following in line with previous administrations' policies. How much leeway do you think administrations have to really change policies altogether, or how much are they really locked in by past policies, choosing between having to completely disassemble something that's already underway and eat those costs if they want to change? And how much does that impact our long-term strategy, especially in comparison to someone like China, who has a little bit more stability at the top?
Yeah, good question. And since it was mentioned you're an Air Force officer, I received some good news recently. My recent book, The Logic of American Nuclear Strategy, was selected for the Air Force's professional reading list. So you can put that on your reading list. You know, I think one of the reasons there is something of a consensus on U.S. nuclear policy is that you can't get it done without a consensus. Because especially when it comes to these modernization programs, you know, building a new nuclear system takes years, 7 to 10 years at kind of the minimum. And these modernization plans are going to play out over the course of 30 years. So who pays for that? You know, the executive branch doesn't get to pay for it. Congress has to pay for it. So that means you need to get bipartisan majorities in Congress to fund in the defense bill year after year these nuclear capabilities. So you really can't do it without bipartisan consensus. So the modernization program of the Triad, you've got a bipartisan consensus there. And basically in 2010, the Obama administration made an arms control for modernization deal with Republicans. The Obama administration really wanted this New START treaty with Russia. Republicans in the Senate were skeptical. And they said, okay, well, our nuclear weapons are getting old, so let's cut a deal. You agree to modernize our nukes. We'll agree to this treaty. And so you got the agreement that way. So it's one of the things that people are worried about now is, will any of these Trump policies upset this consensus? So I think there is agreement on the Triad modernization. The two new low-yield nuclear weapons are more controversial. And in fact, Adam Smith, the incoming chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, Democratic chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, has basically said he wants to cut funding for those programs. So I know my friends in the Pentagon are gearing up to try to make the case to him that we need these capabilities to deter Russia. The other question that some people in Washington are asking is if there is consensus because you have a kind of modernization arms control pact, what happens if the arms control piece goes away? Even if it's not the U.S. fault, even if it's because Russia's cheating on all these agreements and tearing them up. Can you get Democratic support for modernization if you don't have the carrot of arms control to hang alongside of it? So yes, in short, I think especially on the deterrence piece, you have to have bipartisan consensus, otherwise it doesn't work. Yes?
I'm a first-year undergraduate student, but I was actually curious in terms of the Iran nuclear deal. And you mentioned that a lot of leverage has been gained for future renegotiations. But do you think that if the Trump administration is reelected for the future election, is it possible that they're going to utilize that leverage in actually re-engaging with Iran in another treaty, or is it possible that we're going to sort of erode our relations if they choose not to?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I don't know that the administration has a clear policy on this yet. Well, let me back up. Mike Pompeo gave a speech at the Heritage Foundation, a think tank in Washington, where he laid out the strategy. And so he said he had 12 objectives for a renegotiated deal with Iran. And so the 12 objectives were shut down enrichment altogether, shut down the ballistic missile program altogether, stop supporting terrorism, stop human rights abuses in Iran, and 8 other things as well. And so many people said, well, that's completely unrealistic. What Pompeo said publicly was, well, we're just asking Iran to be a normal country. We don't have to ask Canada to stop human rights violations, to stop testing ballistic missiles. We just want Iran to behave like other countries. What some administration officials have said privately is, yeah, that may be unrealistic, but that's how you negotiate. You start with what you want, not with what your bottom line is. And the Obama administration made a mistake by starting with their bottom line, and then they got negotiated off of that. So we're starting with our maximum, but the goal is to renegotiate. And I think Trump does fancy himself to be a master negotiator. I think Trump would probably like to sit down with Rouhani or with the Supreme Leader and try to negotiate this. I think most of the administration probably thinks that we need to do a little bit more to set the table first in terms of pressure on Iran, a little bit more to try to get some international consensus on the need to renegotiate, because again, we tried with the Europeans and they said no. So I think for now, everybody is kind of trying to wait out the Trump administration. If they win in 2020, then I think people will have to reset their expectations. And then, okay, we have 4 years. This is still a serious problem. Maybe at that point, the Europeans would be more willing to engage with the Trump administration. Maybe also at that point, Iran would decide we're going to reinstate our leverage in this situation. We're going to start ramping up our nuclear program to put pressure on the Trump administration and the rest of the international community. Right now, the best estimates are that if they dash to a nuclear weapons capability, it would take about 12 months. So if they decided to do that, we'd potentially have only 12 months to solve the problem, and we could be back into the kind of crisis we were in 2012, where raising serious questions about are we willing to live with a nuclear-armed Iran, and if not, are we willing to take military action? But I hope we don't get to that point. I hope we can set the table for negotiations. Yeah, Eric.
Yeah, thank you very much for your comments. I don't think I've often heard, and I think this is one of the sort of talents that you have. It's not uncommon for a policymaker to cover a lot of different details, but it's difficult sometimes to extract insights from it because they have an agenda. Oftentimes academics are very good at exposing some insights about the world, but they tend to focus on one thing and ignore a lot of other things. So that was really nice, this sort of intelligent, well-paced laundry list of stuff having to do with nuclear weapons. I want to push back on just one thing, and that's the low yield stuff. Mm-hmm. And in talking about why the U.S. had a much larger arsenal than some other countries, you pointed to some details about the difference in the nature of the objectives for the U.S. arsenal. And I wonder if that's not also the case on the other end of the process, that for the same reasons, or for similar reasons, that the U.S. has a different set of objectives and a different physical reality that intermediate range ballistic missiles either don't bias very much or potentially expose certain kinds of vulnerabilities that we have. And without going into a lot of detail that we can talk offline about, I'd love your reaction. Essentially, it takes us into a game of competitive risk-taking at a lower threshold. And that's a game in a setting where we're going to be the losers because we're the less resolved actor in most of those settings.
Yeah. Well, great question, Eric. And I'm always hesitant to engage in a discussion with Professor Gartsky because he's really one of the smartest people I know on Earth. So I'll tread carefully here.
Matt doesn't know many people.
And so you're lucky to have him here at UCSD. So first, I think you're right that it is basically a game of competitive risk-taking. And so those of you who haven't done a lot of nuclear strategy, Thomas Schelling won the Nobel Prize in Economics in part for his game-theoretic work on nuclear strategy. And essentially what he said is that in the nuclear era, countries have something of a dilemma. They have this suicide or surrender problem. On one hand, they can't intentionally fight a nuclear war because it could lead to suicide. On the other hand, they still have serious geopolitical interests. They have conflicts of interest with other nuclear-armed states. And so they don't just want to say, okay, go ahead and take whatever you want. You have nuclear weapons. We're not willing to mess with you. So how do you deal with this situation? Well, Schelling said the space in the middle is nuclear brinkmanship. And so basically what countries do is essentially play games of nuclear chicken. They take steps that raise the risk of nuclear war. They get into crises, use conventional force, make nuclear threats, put nuclear weapons on high alert, maybe use limited nuclear strikes, to raise the risk of nuclear war, hoping that the other side is less resolved and would back down. And so Schelling said in these games of nuclear chicken, then it becomes a competition in risk-taking. It's really the country that's willing to run the greatest risk of nuclear war before backing down that will get its way. Bob Jervis at Columbia, who I mentioned before, put it nicely. He said that states have a dilemma that nuclear war must be avoided, but the enemy's need to avoid nuclear war can be used for leverage. And so, you use the enemy's need to avoid nuclear war for leverage. So you get into these games of competitive risk-taking. Now, conventionally, what people have argued is that what matters in these games of risk-taking is resolve and the underlying political stakes. That one country is going to care more about this issue than another, and that country is going to be willing to run greater risks. So they look at the Cuban Missile Crisis and they say, well, of course, the United States won. The Soviet Union withdrew its missiles in the end because Cuba is a small island off the coast of Florida. The United States really cared a lot. But for the Soviet Union, this was about projecting power in a distant geographic region. They cared less. So we were willing to run a greater risk of nuclear war. They backed down. What Professor Gartsky is essentially saying, if we get into one of these games of nuclear chicken with Russia over Estonia, Russia is going to care more and they're going to back down and will be more likely to back down. So there is that argument that Russia is going to care more about its near abroad than we're going to care about Estonia. And indeed, I think that's part of the reason that Russia sees this strategy as attractive. I think Putin thinks that he has an advantage in stakes. I think he thinks he has an advantage in capabilities. He has this rung on the escalation ladder. He can use these battlefield nuclear weapons. We really can't. And I think there's kind of a third advantage just in his willingness to threaten and use nuclear weapons. There's a nuclear taboo in the West in a way that just doesn't really exist in Russia. They've always seen them more as regular weapons. So I think for all these reasons, he sees this as attractive. But this still creates real problems for the United States. We have allies in Eastern Europe that we want to defend. If we back down when Putin uses nuclear weapons, it doesn't just mean we lose Estonia. It could mean the end of U.S. commitments worldwide. If we back down and let Putin take Estonia, what does Japan think about our commitments to them? What does South Korea think about our commitments? What do our partners in the Middle East think? And if it's the case that Russia actually uses one of these nuclear weapons and then we back down, what does that mean for nuclear deterrence? I think for decades we've said that we're willing to use nuclear weapons to defend allies in the face of nuclear armed states. If an enemy uses a nuclear weapons and we back down, I think suddenly that nuclear deterrent threat looks completely incredible. And so I think that has a number of implications that our allies are going to say, we can't rely on Washington anymore. We need to build our own nuclear weapons. I think our enemies are going to say, this is the key to beating Washington. Putin showed us the way. Use one nuclear weapon and Washington crumbles. So I think that makes it maybe more likely that China, North Korea, and others use nuclear weapons in future crises. More likely that other non-nuclear states decide to pursue nuclear weapons as a way to beat the United States. So I think when you think about it that way, our stake is actually pretty high. It's not just Estonia. It's about the entire rules-based international order, the global non-proliferation regime. So I think we need to do a better job of communicating that in Washington and to Putin. You might think you have an advantage in stakes here, but actually, for you, this is about your near abroad. For us, it's about world order and the future of the non-proliferation regime. And so we can close the resolve gap, I think, to some of the stakes gap. And then we can close the capabilities gap by having these low-yield weapons. I mean, right now, part of the problem we have is we have a gap in the ladder. So we're playing this game of competitive risk-taking, and then we get to a point, where Russia has options and we don't. So again, we have the suicide or surrender problem. Do we immediately go to a large-scale nuclear war, or do we back down? Having these capabilities allows us to keep going in the ladder. In terms of his willingness to threaten and use nuclear weapons, that's going to be a harder one to deal with. The way I see it, I think the Eastern Europeans are perfectly comfortable with threatening or using nuclear weapons for their defense. In fact, a colleague of mine who's the Undersecretary of Defense in the Ministry of Defense in Poland has said if Western Europeans are squeamish about nuclear weapons, if they don't want U.S. forward deployed nuclear weapons, we'll happily take them. bring them to Poland to protect us from Russia. And I think the United States, because of the stakes I talked about, is also would be willing to use nuclear weapons in this situation if necessary to defend Eastern Europe. I think the weak part is kind of the middle of Europe, the Germans, the Italians. If it requires getting their consensus to retaliate to a Russian nuclear attack, it's going to be that's going to be difficult, and I think Putin sees that as one of his strengths. So, long-winded answer, and in part I agree. I think that Putin does have some advantages there, but I think the goal of U.S. strategy then is to do our best to take away those asymmetries. Yeah.
I'm Matt Millarg. I'm a postdoc here at cPASS. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more as to the INF pullout. I mean, most of our allies, especially the NATO allies, were all in agreement they're cheating. They said that or hinted at it for years, but their approach was different. And specifically, I wonder do you think there really were any more alternatives after the years of all the cheating that had been going on? What did those alternatives really look like, and how did Europeans try to really carry that out? Or yeah, I guess that's the question.
Yeah, good. So a few thoughts here. One, so NATO did come out and say they had been saying for years that Russia was cheating. In the end, NATO did endorse the Trump administration's decision to pull out of the agreement, but they reluctantly endorsed that, I think. And apparently the Germans and Angela Merkel said, actually, we didn't do our job preparing our public for this. We should have known this was coming, and we didn't really prepare the public. Give us some more time to make the case to our public as to why you need to pull out of this treaty. And so that's part of the reason. I don't know if you remember, there was a big announcement in October. Trump first announced it at a rally, I think, in Nevada or something. But then the official statement didn't come until December. But the official statement said we're going to be pulling out in 6. So it was kind of a staggered decision. I think that was part of the reason, as a favor to the Europeans, to give them more time. In terms of what were the alternatives, you could have put additional sanctions on Russia as for pulling out. You could have, some people said, well, we don't really need an intermediate range system. And in fact, we might not even be able to deploy intermediate range systems in Europe because you'd have to get the agreement of European countries, and that would be difficult. Now, it would be conventional armed, likely. I think the administration right now is talking about building intermediate range systems in response, but so far only talking about conventionally armed, not nuclear armed. And so there'd be two options. One is building a new system from scratch, which would take 7 to 10 years. So some of the options that are being considered are actually repurposing existing capabilities. So taking like the Tomahawk sea-launched cruise missile and putting it in a box on the ground, or taking JASSM, an air-launched cruise missile, and putting it on the ground. So there are some things we could do in the near term. But that's out. And more sanctions, asking the Russians to talk about it. What's interesting is the Russians refused to even admit there was anything going on until the Trump administration said they're pulling out. And then suddenly Russia was willing to talk. They said, well, come and take a look at the system. But that wouldn't have really done much good. It wouldn't have, just by looking at it, you wouldn't have been able to tell the ranges or other things like that. So one of the options would be to just let Russia cheat while we stay in the treaty. So there are some other things you could have done, but I don't. Well, I maybe buried the lead. I don't think anyone, even people who said we should stay in the treaty, thought there was any hope of getting Russia to come back into compliance. Everybody, they've been building this system, they're deploying it. There's really no hope of getting them to come back into compliance. So the question is then, given that the treaty is dead, what do you do? Do we remain in compliance and try to punish Russia in other ways, or do we pull out? And the administration decided to pull out. Yeah.
Do you see any possibility of a bipartisan deal on weapons modernization, nuclear modernization? You invoked that idea during your talk. Do you see anything in there? Do you see the defense, at least defense policy, intellectuals on each side, have some capacity to talk to each other?
Yes. So I think there is basic bipartisan agreement on the need to modernize the strategic forces, so the bombers, the submarines, and the ICBMs. The plans to do that were put in place by Obama. They're going to be continued with Trump. The Trump administration has announced these new low-yield nuclear weapons, which potentially could upset that. What's interesting is that Republicans are, for the most part, in favor. Democrats are divided. The more defense-minded Democrats, including former Obama administration officials, say they support this. Some of the more progressive wing, more focused on arms control and denuclearization and disarmament, are opposed to it. So I think that's one thing, these low-yield nuclear weapons that could threaten it a little bit. On the other hand, in some ways it makes the modernization of the strategic forces more guaranteed because it's shifted the debate. Rather than fighting over modernization of the triad, now Adam Smith and others are fighting over the low-yield nuclear weapons and INF. And so some Democrats in Washington have even said, was this just a negotiating tactic? You're talking about building these new nuclear weapons, so we fight over that and you save the old stuff? I don't think that was really the case, but I do think that has been a result, that the modernization of the triad is, I think, more guaranteed now than it was. And the real fight's going to be over these low-yield capabilities. Yes.
So, I'm sorry, but I have two questions, if that's all right. Is it?
Mm-hmm.
My name is Aaron Gannon. I'm a fourth-year undergrad here at Poli-Sci. One, you mentioned that in response to Professor Gartsky's question on the low-yield risk game scenario, you mentioned it was a scenario where it was a calculation of the world system for the US versus Russia concerning its near abroad. If you examine writers like Daniels, Kaplan, or even speakers like Posner, they hypothesize that it's not a question of the near abroad to Russia, but rather, to take a phrase from Professor Madania's, social survival. They've seen a world where there has been regime change that has resulted in the deaths of the people who are in charge. And if you look at, say, The Revenge of Geography by Kaplan, there is an argument to be made for this historical geographic paranoia that has just saturated the Russian culture, so to speak. Would it not then be accurate to say that they don't see this as a question of the near abroad, but rather a question of, do we die now or later? More akin to, say, the Central Powers of World War I, where they could fall behind simply due to being declining powers. And as a second part, we've talked about Russia not being willing to negotiate, but in 2002, the US pulled out of the anti-ballistic missile treaties that, of course, take everything Russia says with a grain of salt, but they claim that the weapons that they did eventually develop were in response to us pulling out in 2018. Given the fact that nuclear weapons are not a human-intensive, but a capital-intensive form of weaponry, and Russia, blatantly put, just doesn't have the capital to compete with us, and they are aware of this, why would they not want to renegotiate something like the ABM system, which was the key part of SALT and guaranteeing non-proliferation, since it helped ensure mutual assured destruction?
Yeah, good questions, and I'll take the second one first. So I think Russia would love to negotiate over ballistic missiles again for some of the reasons, missile defenses, again, for some of the reasons that you mentioned. They know that we're much better at that than they are, and so if they can limit it, it's in their advantage. Yeah, that is one thing we could negotiate over. Now, U.S. policy for many years has been that we're unwilling to negotiate over arms control. Getting tired, over missile defenses. After we pulled out in the Bush administration, it was controversial at first. Now I think there's a bipartisan consensus on missile defense, and the consensus is we need missile defense to deal with rogue states, especially North Korea. And so we're going to have a limited missile defense system to deal with rogue states, but this system doesn't pose a threat to Russia or China. And if you just look at the capability of the systems and the quantities we're deploying it in, Russia and China could overwhelm our systems. That said, I think you're right that the Russians are paranoid, and they think that we're much better than we are. I think they believe that we might have a perfect first strike capability. I talk to my Russian colleagues or Chinese colleagues, and they say, you guys are going to turn off our nuclear weapons with some kind of cyber attack, and then you're going to follow it up with conventional strikes, with Tomahawk land attack cruise missiles and your hypersonic glide vehicles and stuff that doesn't even exist yet. And then you're going to have missile defense systems with lasers and other stuff that zaps our retaliation out of the sky.
Sharks with lasers.
Sharks with lasers. So I think they are paranoid, and so they would love to limit our ballistic missile defenses for that reason. So yeah, if we were willing to include missile defenses, I think the Russians would be willing to discuss that. Second, on what is the Russian stake, I think that's a good point as well. And I think that's one of the reasons that Russia might be willing to use nuclear weapons in a conflict in Eastern Europe. So Russian official policy says that they would only use nuclear weapons if the existence of the Russian state were under threat. And so some people have said, well, you guys are crazy to think they would do this escalate to de-escalate thing if it's a war in Estonia, that the Russian state's existence isn't under threat. But the question is, from Putin's mind, is the existence at threat? And I think for Putin, losing a war in Estonia may very well, in his mind, be equivalent to the Russian state being at threat. I mean, could he politically survive losing a major war with NATO on Russia's border? So I think that's one of the things that could motivate him to use nuclear weapons early. So in short, I think I agree that Russia's stakes are high. I guess what I'm saying is our stakes are high too, and I don't think we do a good enough job of communicating that to our allies, to ourselves, or to the Russians. And moreover, we have a policy problem, which is that right now we have allies that we really can't defend. If Russia invades Estonia and is willing to use low-yield nuclear weapons to hold on to that territory, we don't have a very good response. And so these low-yield nuclear weapons help to make that problem less severe for us. So yeah, it's challenging, but we can't just give up. It's an important interest. Yeah.
So taking into account all the proxy wars between Saudi Arabia and Iran, as well as the fact that all these nuclear deals are currently being broken up, what do you think the likelihood of Saudi Arabia wanting to enrich them?
Yeah, good question. So after the Iran nuclear deal was signed, Saudi Arabia said whatever nuclear capabilities Iran gets, we get as well. And so Saudi Arabia was saying, you say Iran can enrich uranium, we can enrich uranium. Actually pulling out of the Iran deal has helped us, at least rhetorically in that regard, because now we can go to Saudi Arabia and say, you can't enrich, and neither can Iran. So yes, they are, but that's despite our wishes, you can't enrich either. Now, there's been some bad reporting recently that some of you may have seen that suggests that the Trump administration is secretly negotiating to allow Saudi Arabia to have uranium enrichment, but it's just bad reporting. So the question is a 1, 2, 3 nuclear cooperation agreement with Saudi Arabia. So as I mentioned before, U.S. policy has always been to say, if you want reactors, fine, we'll help you. You can't make the fuel. And so that's what's happening now. The United States is negotiating with Saudi Arabia over the reactors. Now in these 1, 2, 3 agreements, there's a question about whether the country would forever forswear to never enrich or reprocess, to never do this sensitive stuff. So almost every one of these that the United States has ever negotiated, the country doesn't forswear to never enrich or reprocess. One time with the United Arab Emirates in about 2009 or so, we got this so-called gold standard for nonproliferation, where the United Arab Emirates agreed in the 1, 2, 3 agreement to never enrich or reprocess. So that was a great thing. We don't want countries to enrich or reprocess. It was great that the UAE signed up for that. It would be great if we could get that in every deal. But since then, we've negotiated other 1, 2, 3 agreements with countries without the gold standard. So the Obama administration negotiated a 1, 2, 3 agreement with Jordan without that gold standard. They negotiated a 1-2-3 agreement with Vietnam without that gold standard. And so what the Trump administration is doing now is negotiating a 1-2-3 agreement with Saudi Arabia. At first, we pushed for the gold standard, where Saudi Arabia would agree never to enrich or reprocess. Saudi Arabia said, no, we won't agree to that. And so the question is, do we go ahead with this peaceful nuclear cooperation agreement, despite the fact that they won't forswear it in the agreement? It looks like the Trump administration will go ahead with that. But again, that's the standard we've used many times before, including with Vietnam and Jordan recently under the Obama administration. So the reporting that says we're secretly allowing them to enrich or reprocess is just very bad reporting. Our policy is still they can't enrich or reprocess. We won't help them do that. We would resist if they tried to do it. The question is, do they sign away that right forever in this agreement or not? Yes?
So following up on that question, how important is it that, that Iran disengage in its nuclear arms program? We're already selling so many conventional weapons to Saudi Arabia, for example, and I'm not sure if any of those are nuclear. So how important is it for Iran to disengage?
Well, it's very important that Iran shut down its nuclear program from a U.S. interest point of view. Iran would be only the second country after North Korea to sign the NPT cheat and build nuclear weapons. So it undermines global nonproliferation. Second, if Iran builds nuclear weapons, it might not stop with Iran. Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey, and other countries could, over time, attempt to build nuclear weapons in response. Third, Iran could export sensitive nuclear material and technology. I wrote my first book on nuclear technology transfer. Iran is the kind of country that would be at risk of helping other countries with this sensitive technology. In addition, you could have a less stable Middle East. We know right now that Iran restrains its foreign policy in part because it fears that if it goes too far, it could lead to an attack from Israel or the United States. If it had nuclear weapons, it might believe that that could serve as a shield that would allow it to get away with more aggression and coercive diplomacy in the region. And third, there could be a risk of nuclear war. And I don't think, it's high, wouldn't want to exaggerate it. But you would have future crises with a nuclear-armed Iran and nuclear-armed Israel, nuclear-armed Iran and a nuclear-armed United States. In the future, maybe nuclear-armed Iran, nuclear Saudi Arabia, and others. And in high-stakes nuclear crises, there is the risk that things could spin out of control. So I don't think any of us thought that JFK was crazy. But after the Cuban Missile Crisis, JFK said the risk of nuclear war was somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2. So if Kennedy was willing to run a 50% chance of nuclear war with a nuclear superpower over missiles in Cuba, then what's the risk of nuclear war that Iran's supreme leader is going to run in a future crisis in the Middle East? I don't know the answer, but I know that it's greater than 0. So I think it's very important that we stop Iran from building nuclear weapons. In terms of U.S. support to Saudi Arabia, the United States does provide, sells conventional weaponry to Saudi Arabia, like it does to many other countries around the world. Doesn't provide nuclear capabilities to Saudi Arabia, and in fact has never provided nuclear capabilities to any other country. John, you had your hand up for a while.
Oh, I have lots of interesting questions.
Yeah.
I think there's a verse there about Russia. I saw the second Eric's comment. The waterfront that you've covered is very impressive. I keep get puzzling over, this widespread assumption we have that Russia has this escalate to de-escalate doctrine. It's a very convenient phrase. But you talk to Russians, like Christine Van writing me, and keep saying this doesn't exist. It's ear-imaging. They come up with a lot of other different stories. It comes back to the story of paranoia, right? We had these same capabilities during the Cold War, but when it came down to it, the Russians thought in terms of massive response, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just curious, what's the evidence for it, right? Is it kind of just hedging that Putin might be crazy enough to do this? If that's the way we're thinking, then we can think of lots of other scenarios that we might use before we would start reaching for this one, which is pretty sporting, right? Maybe it might work out, but I'd probably be better off at least starting to play the ASAT card way before that. Now we're in a really different world. So if we're kind of just thinking out of the box that Putin might do this, but he might do a lot of other things, then why then, now I guess the second question, why then are we driven towards this very narrow sense of well, now there's this nuclear escalation ladder that we need to match them at every rung to meet this gap, as opposed to start thinking, well, there's a lot of other things that could be happening in that gap, right? They're modernizing their conventional forces at the same time, so they may come up to meet it in interesting ways. We have lots of capabilities to go horizontal or do it in other parts of the globe to put pressure on them. So where exactly is that gap, given that there are so many other ways to press them in interesting ways and create a great deal of risk and uncertainty in what is guaranteed to be just a fundamentally complex battlefield? So I guess two questions there. So what's the evidence that this actually is the Russian strategy, right? And if we're wrong about it and we find ourselves in more of a spiral dynamic, what are the costs of being wrong about that? And then the second one is like, are we being too narrow in the way that we're thinking about this escalation?
Yeah, good questions. First one, does Russia have this escalate to de-escalate strategy, and what's the evidence? So just one piece of evidence is when you look when the Trump administration has made claims before that the intelligence community disagrees with, or that the Obama administration disagrees with, you had leaks to the press within seconds. Everybody's saying this is crazy. Where do they get this? You'll notice there haven't been any disagreement about that in Washington. So seems to imply that the intelligence community thinks this is a threat, that former Obama administration officials think this is a threat. So it's possible that the entire U.S. national security apparatus is wrong about this. We've been wrong about things before. But I think it is worth pointing out that Olga Oliker and Kristen Van Buskirk are in the minority of people who think about this issue in Washington. What is the evidence? I don't think that there's a document written somewhere that says escalate to de-escalate. If this happens, we're going to do this. And Putin himself probably doesn't know. These things are context specific. But there's a lot of circumstantial evidence. So first, retired military officers, senior officers in Russia have written about this publicly and how it would make sense. Second, Russia's building a lot of tactical nuclear weapons. Why are they building these tactical nuclear weapons unless they think that they can use them for something? Third, in their exercise, well, I mean, it must be a priority if they're spending money on it. It's a costly signal. It's a priority. Third, in their military exercises, they have conducted nuclear strikes, including a nuclear strike against Warsaw. Officials making public nuclear threats in tense international statements. The crisis in Ukraine, I think, was very much a nuclear crisis. Putin said we're a major nuclear power. It's best not to mess with us. Some others as well. So I think, again, I don't think there's a secret document that says this is a strategy, but a lot of circumstantial evidence that this is what Russia would do. And let's just give Olga and others the benefit of the doubt that maybe this isn't their strategy. I think all these other pieces of evidence suggest that there's a high enough probability that this could happen, that it would be irresponsible for U.S. defense officials not to at least think about this possibility and how we would deal with it. Why not deal with it in other ways? We do have a lot of other capabilities. Cyber, an area that you're an expert on. Conventional responses, and we could have a long discussion about this. But I think deterrence is in the mind of the beholder. I'm not trying to deter you or the other people in this room. We're trying to deter Putin. So the question is, what does Putin respect, and what does Putin care about? And I think that there's a lot of evidence that Putin cares about nuclear weapons. That if we say, if you do this, we're going to respond with sanctions or cyber, I don't think that's going to scare Putin. If we say, you've got nukes, we've got nukes too, I think he takes that seriously. Yes?
Well, I think it's appropriate at this point to thank our speaker for a terrific presentation.
Thank you. Thanks, sir. My pleasure. Thanks for having me.